The rain had been falling for most of the drive. Not a downpour, just a steady whispering drizzle that painted the pine trees in shades of silver and turned the winding road into something out of a forgotten dream. Nathan gripped the wheel a little tighter as the narrow lane veered again. He was almost there. Olivia had insisted he go up to the cottage early, said her mum would already be there, getting things ready. She'd come up the next day, after her shift at the clinic. It made sense on paper. It didn't feel strange when Olivia said it. But now, with dusk settling behind the hills and his tires crunching on the gravel path leading to the cottage, it felt different. More intimate than it should have. The cottage appeared through the trees like something out of a storybook. White clapboard, wrap-around porch, ivy crawling up the sides like it had secrets to keep. There was a curl of smoke from the chimney, soft yellow light glowing behind the curtains. Nathan cut the engine and just sat there for a second, heart oddly loud in his chest. He wasn't nervous, not really. He'd met Marilyn twice before, Olivia's mother, and she'd been nothing but gracious, if a little poised. The kind of woman who always knew what to say, when to say it, and how to make you feel slightly transparent under her gaze. The door opened before he knocked. "Nathan," she said, her voice warm but low, like it had just woken from a nap. She stood there barefoot, a glass of wine in her hand, her cardigan slipping down one shoulder, as though it had lost interest in modesty. "You made it through the mountain roads. I was starting to worry." The way she leaned against the doorframe made it feel like she hadn't just been waiting. She'd been expecting him. Inside, the cottage smelled of pine and clove, firewood, and something faintly sweet. Nathan stepped in and toed off his shoes, suddenly hyper-aware of how damp his jeans were from the walk-up. Marilyn moved through the living room with effortless grace, her bare feet making soft contact with the floorboards, her figure outlined in that soft cream cardigan and some kind of silky slip that caught the firelight like it had secrets to whisper. "There's soup on the stove," she said over her shoulder. "And the guest room's down the hall, second door on the left. I didn't expect company tonight. Olivia said you might be late." He followed her slowly, eyes adjusting to the intimacy of the space. The flicker of the fire casting shadows on the walls, a stack of old books by the couch, 2 glasses already set on the dining table. "Thanks, miss. Marilyn," he corrected, flushing slightly. She turned then, her face open, curious. "You don't have to call me that. We're not at Thanksgiving dinner." A smile tugged at her lips, not girlish but quiet, knowing. "And you're not a kid, Nathan. No need for formality." She stepped a little closer, one hand still cradling her wine glass. "Besides, it's just us tonight." That last part wasn't said suggestively. Not quite. But something in the way her voice dropped on the word just made the air feel thicker. Nathan busied himself with his bag, pretending not to notice the tension building between them, like static on a wool sweater. He went to the guest room, dropped his things, then returned to the kitchen, where she was already ladling out soup into mismatched ceramic bowls. She pushed one toward him and handed him a spoon without comment. They sat across from each other at the old oak table, the candle between them swaying slightly in the draught. For a while all they did was eat, quiet, easy. But beneath it, something unspoken kept rising. Not flirtation exactly, but something quieter, something slower. When she spoke again, it was to ask about school, about his major, about Olivia. But even those words felt like they were circling something else. "She talks about you a lot," Marilyn said softly, stirring her spoon without lifting it. "You're good to her. Steady." Her eyes flicked up to his. She needs that. Nathan shrugged, trying to deflect the warmth he felt under that gaze. She's easy to love. Marilyn's smile faltered just slightly. Yes, she said after a moment. She is. They lingered after the bowls were empty, the wine bottle between them growing lighter. And then she stood, gliding toward the fire and leaning one hand on the mantel. Her slip caught the amber light like silk over candle wax. Would you help me bring in more wood? She asked, her voice casual. It's supposed to drop below freezing tonight. Nathan followed her out onto the porch, the night air cold enough to raise goosebumps on his arms. The woodpile was under the eaves, stacked neatly. He reached for a few logs but paused when he turned and saw her there. Marilyn, arms wrapped around herself, eyes on the woods beyond the clearing. There was a stillness in her, something deep and aching, like loneliness that had been well hidden until now. You okay? He asked gently. She turned to him slowly, her hair caught in the wind, and for a moment her expression was unreadable. But then she smiled, a little sadly. It gets quiet out here, she said, especially after dark. And then, after a pause that seemed to last a breath too long, you remind me of someone I knew once, a long time ago. He didn't know what to say to that, so he handed her a few logs. Their fingers touched, and the moment lingered, not by accident. Inside, the fire roared again. They stood near it, each warming their hands, not quite looking at each other. She stepped just a little closer, the firelight flickering across her skin. Nathan could smell her perfume now. Something floral but aged, like roses pressed between the pages of a forgotten book. She turned to him then slowly, and her hand reached for his sleeve, brushing something off that wasn't there. You'll catch a cold in that wet shirt, she said softly. Her hand lingered on his arm. You should change. He nodded but didn't move. Neither did she. Unless, she added, and her voice was barely above a whisper now. You like the cold. He met her eyes, and for the first time didn't look away. Something passed between them then, fragile and electric, like the moment before a storm breaks. Her hand dropped, but the heat of her touch remained on his arm like a brand. She stepped back slowly, her breath slightly unsteady. I'll let you get settled, she murmured. Good night, Nathan. And with that, she turned, the soft swish of her slip brushing her thighs as she moved toward her room. But before she closed the door, she looked back once, and her eyes didn't say good night. They said we both felt that. Nathan stood there for a long time after she disappeared, the fire crackling beside him, and his heart thrumming in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just attraction. It was the slow, inevitable unraveling of something neither of them had meant to start. And it had only just begun. The night settled into a hush, the kind that only happens deep in the woods, where no traffic hums and no distant lights flicker through windows, only the soft chorus of tree branches shifting under the weight of wind and the occasional creak of the old cottage as it settled around them like a second skin. Nathan lay on the guest bed, staring up at the ceiling. Though he could barely make out its outline in the dark, the moonlight spilling faintly through the curtains, painting everything in silver shadows, and despite the soft mattress and thick comforter Olivia's mother had laid out for him, sleep refused to come. He could still feel the warmth of her hand brushing his sleeve, the flicker of something heavier than coincidence in her eyes as she'd looked back at him from the hallway, and no matter how much he told himself not to read into it, that it was just the wine or the loneliness of an empty house, the memory repeated in his head like a slow, unbroken loop. He shifted onto his side, listening for movement in the house, half expecting to hear footsteps, a door, anything to break the silence that had become a little too loaded to feel peaceful anymore. And yet all he could hear was the crackle of embers from the living room fireplace, still fighting against the chill creeping into the walls. Eventually he sat up, running a hand through his hair, the sheets falling from his chest as a gust of cold air pressed against the window pane like breath, and something compelled him to move. Not restlessness exactly, but a gravity that pulled him toward the source of the tension that had taken root in his chest hours ago. He padded barefoot into the hall, careful not to make the floorboards creak too loudly, telling himself he was just thirsty, maybe looking for water. But the truth hung in the back of his mind like a fogged mirror, something he wasn't quite ready to admit even as his steps brought him closer to the living room. The fire had burned lower but not out, casting a low amber light across the room. And there she was, Marilyn, curled sideways on the couch beneath a heavy throw, her bare legs tucked up, one shoulder exposed where her cardigan had slipped again, and the neckline of her silk slip had dipped low as she rested her head on her hand, a half-read book still open on her lap. She didn't startle when he entered. Instead, she looked up slowly, like she had been expecting him, her expression unreadable at first, then softening into something quiet and tender, as though the space between them didn't need words, only breath. "I couldn't sleep," Nathan said finally, his voice hushed, almost apologetic. But she shook her head gently and patted the empty cushion beside her, the invitation unspoken, yet unmistakable, and he moved toward her as if in a trance, his heart pulsing like a drum in his throat. As he sat down, their bodies close, but not yet touching, the warmth from her skin seemed to reach across the short distance between them, like the flicker of a match to kindling. And when she turned to face him, her eyes searched his with an openness that made the air around them feel thick and slow. "This place does that to you," she murmured, her voice like velvet unraveling in the dark. "It keeps you awake, makes you feel things more deeply." Nathan couldn't answer, not because he didn't have words, but because they would have felt too shallow in the presence of whatever was building between them now. A kind of suspended moment, stretched taut with breath and awareness. The firelight danced in her hair, made her skin glow like ivory, and as she leaned slightly closer, he caught the scent of lavender and firewood clinging to her, a mixture that felt at once comforting and provocative, familiar and dangerous. "I used to come here when Olivia was a child," she said softly, her eyes drifting to the fire. "Back then, everything was simpler, quieter, but also lonelier in ways I didn't let myself admit." Her voice carried weight, not in volume but in meaning, and when she looked back at him, something in her gaze flickered. Not sadness exactly, but hunger. Not just for touch, but for understanding, for connection that reached beyond the shallow exchanges of daily life. He reached for the mug on the side table, his fingers grazing hers as he passed it back to her, and the contact made both of them freeze. Not because it was unexpected, but because it felt like more than it should have. Like the softest collision of two tectonic plates, long overdue. Her fingers didn't pull away immediately, and neither did his. The touch lingering, deliberate, heavy with everything they weren't saying. And when she finally took the cup and sipped, the motion broke the spell for a moment. But only for a moment. "You're very kind, Nathan," she said suddenly, her voice lower now, her eyes fixed on him. Not with motherly affection, but with something else. Something braver, more reckless. "That's rare in men your age." He swallowed hard, unsure how to respond, knowing there were lines he shouldn't cross, but feeling undeniably that one had already been erased, not by words or actions, but by the weight of every shared glance, every breath between them in this dark room. "I try to be," he said quietly, and her hand moved, not far, just resting gently on his forearm. And it wasn't a romantic touch in and of itself, but it held a charge that left no room for misinterpretation. He looked down at her hand, then back up into her eyes, and what he saw there made his breath catch. It was desire, yes, but also fear, vulnerability, and something like longing that had lived in silence for too long. And when he didn't move away, when he let her hand remain, her thumb brushing slowly along his skin, the breath she released was almost imperceptible, the kind of breath one takes when surrendering to something that feels inevitable. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Do you ever think about how something begins? Not with a kiss or a touch, but long before that, when a moment lingers too long, or a glance says too much?" Nathan couldn't answer. He didn't need to. Because the truth was yes, he had thought of it. Yes, he was thinking of it now. And when she leaned closer, her knee brushing his thigh, her face just inches from his, her breath warm against his skin, the room fell into silence once more. Not from lack of sound, but because the world outside had ceased to matter. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. And she didn't lean in further. But their foreheads nearly touched, and their eyes were closed. And it was in that pause, in that charged breath of stillness, that they both knew something had shifted. Something had awakened. When he finally stood to return to his room, his hand shook slightly as he reached for the hallway wall for balance, his body still humming with the tension of everything that had just passed between them, and everything that hadn't. Behind him she remained on the couch, her fingers curled in the throw, her lips parted and her eyes wide open, staring into the flames as though she could still feel him sitting beside her. And neither of them would sleep that night, because some feelings, once stirred, do not go quietly back into hiding. They wait. They burn. They bloom in the dark. The morning came veiled in fog, the kind that clings to the earth like a secret and softens everything it touches. Trees blurred like brushstrokes, grass glistening with dew, and the lake behind the cottage a muted mirror reflecting the low-hung sky, as if the world itself had lowered its voice in reverence to what had not been said the night before. Nathan awoke disoriented, the warmth of the bed cocooning him in a kind of quiet denial, as though the memory of Marilyn's nearness could be chalked up to a dream, born of firelight and restless thoughts. But when he rolled onto his back and stared at the wooden ceiling, the echo of her words, her voice, her touch lingered too vividly to dismiss. He dressed slowly, pulling on a soft sweater that still smelled faintly of the detergent Olivia used back in the city, and for a moment that scent grounded him, reminding him who he was supposed to be, what roles he was meant to play. Yet even that small anchor felt precarious now, like something drifting just out of reach. The hallway felt longer in the daylight, quieter somehow, though birdsong drifted in through the cracked windows, and as he approached the kitchen, he paused. Not from fear or uncertainty, but from a tension that had settled behind his ribs like the stretch before thunder breaks, a taut, breathless anticipation of what might unfold next. She was already there. Marilyn stood by the sink, her hair swept into a loose bun, a long linen robe tied at her waist, and the morning light caught on her collarbone, where the fabric dipped slightly, revealing just enough skin to make his throat go dry. Not because she was trying to be seductive, but because she didn't need to try. Because everything about her presence, carried an elegance that made looking away feel like a failure of nerve. She turned at the sound of his steps, a soft smile playing at her lips, her expression unreadable, except for the way her gaze lingered just a beat too long before drifting to the coffee pot she held, and without a word, she reached for a second mug and began to pour. "Did you sleep?" she asked finally, her tone neutral, polite even. But the way her fingers wrapped around the mug as she handed it to him betrayed the tension between them, that unspoken thread still pulling taut in the air between their bodies. He accepted the cup and nodded, then shrugged, unable to lie convincingly. "Not really," he admitted, his eyes meeting hers across the rim, and something flickered there. Not guilt, not shame, but recognition, like they were sharing a memory, only half-formed, but deeply felt. They sat at the kitchen table facing the lake, sipping in silence for several long minutes, and the calm of the room, the way the fog swirled just beyond the windows, made everything feel suspended in a moment. Neither of them wanted to end. "I used to come here with Olivia's father," she said eventually, her voice far away, like it had traveled through years to reach him. "When we were young, before things became complicated, before he stopped looking at me the way you did last night." Nathan's breath caught in his chest, not because he was surprised, not really, but because she had said it aloud, had taken what hung in the air between them and given it shape, and now he had no place to hide from the truth that had been quietly unfolding since the moment he stepped through her door. "I didn't mean to," he began, but she shook her head slowly, the movement gentle, forgiving, but final. "Don't," she said softly. "Don't apologize for something you didn't say, and don't pretend you didn't feel it." The way she looked at him then, eyes clear and unflinching, made his pulse beat louder in his ears, and the room felt smaller, warmer, as though the fire from the night before had never quite gone out, only hidden itself beneath layers of domestic normalcy. She stood then, slowly, deliberately, her hand brushing the edge of the table as she walked around to his side. Not hurried, not tentative, but with the quiet determination of someone stepping into a decision they had already made. He watched her approach, unsure whether to stand or stay, whether to speak or listen, but by the time she stopped beside him, none of it mattered, because her hand reached out, brushed lightly against his shoulder, then trailed down the length of his arm with the barest pressure, and his entire body reacted like a current had passed through him. "I thought I was past this kind of feeling," she murmured almost to herself, her fingers still resting just above his wrist. "But you've made it impossible to pretend." He turned to face her then, slowly, meeting her gaze without flinching, and what he saw there was not just attraction. It was fear, courage, memory, and something dangerously close to longing, the kind that years of solitude and control can no longer contain. His hand rose, not to touch her, but to rest near hers on the table, and the space between them became charged again, the air thick with possibilities neither of them had dared to name until now. "You haven't done anything wrong," she whispered, stepping slightly closer, and when her knee brushed his thigh, neither of them moved away, the contact small but irrevocable, like a door opening just wide enough to let the storm in. They stayed like that, close, unmoving, for several heartbeats, the world narrowing to the subtle rhythm of breath and proximity, until finally her hand shifted, fingers curling lightly around his, the gesture so intimate, so careful, it felt like the first line in a letter too dangerous to finish. He didn't pull away. He couldn't. And when she leaned forward, resting her forehead lightly against his temple, her lips brushing the shell of his ear as she exhaled. The sensation made his entire frame tense with restraint. "I keep asking myself what I'm doing," she said softly. "And every time, I think about how it feels to be looked at like I matter again." Those words hit something inside him, a tender, vulnerable ache he hadn't known he carried. And when he turned his face, just slightly, their lips nearly touched. Not quite, but close enough that every breath, every shift of air between them became a silent confession. Then, without warning, the sound of tires on gravel pierced the moment, sudden and sharp. A car approaching. Olivia's unmistakable red hatchback coming into view around the bend of the woods. Marilyn pulled back as if burned, her face going pale, her hand retreating so quickly it felt like a wound, and she turned away, moving toward the sink with too much urgency, her back now a wall between them. Nathan stood slowly, heart still hammering, unsure what to say, unsure what to do. And by the time Olivia opened the front door, chipper and unaware, everything between him and her mother had been folded up, tucked away beneath layers of practiced normalcy. But it wasn't gone. It was just waiting. Waiting for another quiet moment, another look too long, another silence too heavy to carry. Because something had begun now that neither of them could undo. And the storm that hadn't broken was still gathering in the quiet places. The lake had turned to glass again, a silent expanse of dusk blue, framed by tall pines that whispered to each other in the hush before nightfall. And the wind, which had carried the laughter of Olivia and Nathan all afternoon, now slipped through the trees, as if cautious not to disturb the fragile stillness, taking hold within the cottage walls. Olivia had gone into town to pick up groceries and promised to bring back a bottle of wine and something sweet and impulsive, flashing her playful grin before kissing Nathan's cheek and disappearing down the path, her footsteps crunching over the gravel in a rhythm that would haunt Marilyn long after. She had watched from the porch, one hand resting absently on the railing, the other wrapped around her wrist in a tight grip she didn't notice. And when the red car finally vanished through the trees, the stillness she'd been dreading wrapped itself around her like a second skin, one that both suffocated and seduced. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old pine, firewood, and something warmer now, something human and immediate, like skin and breath, the essence of people who had lingered too long in rooms without naming what had passed between them. Nathan stood in the living room, half turned toward the fire, which had been rekindled more out of habit than need. And when he heard the door shut behind Marilyn, he didn't move, not right away. Not until her steps crossed the floor, slow and deliberate, and stopped just behind him. Neither of them spoke. Silence had become its own language between them, one more honest than any words they could manage. She stepped closer. The space between their bodies became a sliver, then less. He could feel the warmth of her behind him, the subtle stir of her breath as it passed over his neck, and when her hand rose, not quite touching, but hovering, tentative, the moment stretched impossibly long. Then finally, she touched him. Her fingers brushed his back, just a whisper over the fabric of his shirt, a test, a question. And when he didn't step away, when he didn't even breathe, her touch deepened, her palm pressing lightly between his shoulder blades, as though she meant to anchor herself to something real. He turned slowly, the motion delicate, deliberate, and when their eyes met, the silence collapsed into something else entirely. There was no pretense left, no justification or hesitancy, just the trembling gravity of two people who had spent too long resisting what had already taken root. "I tried," she whispered, her voice breaking around the edges. "I tried not to feel this." "So did I," he answered, his own voice just above a breath. And when her hand found his chest, when her fingers curled against the thudding rhythm of his heart, the pull between them finally won. He kissed her. It wasn't rushed or wild. It was slow, searching. The kind of kiss that trembled on the verge of something deeper, something fragile and irreversible. Her lips were soft but certain, tasting of regret and courage all at once. And when he pulled her gently closer, her body fit against his like it had always been meant to, her arms slipping around his waist, her head resting against his collarbone, as though she needed a moment not to fall apart. Neither of them spoke as they stood there, the fire casting gold across their faces, their shadows merging on the wall like the outline of a single figure. But the line had been crossed, not just physically, but emotionally, completely, and they both knew it. She stepped back first, but only enough to look at him, her hand still resting on his arm, her thumb moving in slow, thoughtful circles. Her voice was steady now, quieter than before. "What do we do now?" Nathan shook his head, not in denial, but in awe of the question itself, the weight of what it meant. "I don't know," he said honestly, and she smiled, a small wounded thing, because the truth, spoken aloud like that, made it feel even more real. He reached for her hand again, and this time she didn't pull away. They stood together, side by side, watching the fire. Outside, the wind picked up again. The trees sighed. The cottage, as always, kept its secrets. But inside, something had changed. Something permanent. Something that would live in every glance, every brush of skin, every breath shared in silence from that moment on. And nothing would ever be the same. Not for her, not for him. Not even for the way the air moved between them now, forever altered by a single quiet kiss. The kiss that could never be undone. The kiss that had always, somehow, been waiting.